They built over 1,100 warships. Their steel held up the Empire State Building, the Golden Gate Bridge, the George Washington Bridge. At their peak, 300,000 Americans punched the clock at Bethlehem Steel. One ship per day. That was the promise to FDR, and they exceeded it. By 2003, gone, dissolved, liquidated, every furnace cold, every paycheck vanished. How does a company that literally built modern America end up as a casino parking lot? This is the story of Bethlehem Steel, the most important industrial company you've probably never fully understood. The year is 1857. A man named Augustus Woolley organizes a modest iron-making operation in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, calling it the Saucona Iron Company. Bad timing. The Panic of 1857, a nationwide financial meltdown, kills the venture before it can even breathe. But this is the Lehigh Valley. Coal is close. The Lehigh River cuts straight through the terrain. Rail lines are already connecting eastern Pennsylvania to major northeastern markets. The geography is practically begging for heavy industry. So the effort reorganizes. The site moves to South Bethlehem. The name changes to the Bethlehem Rolling Mill and Iron Company. By 1860, Alfred Hunt is elected president. And then the Civil War changes everything. Construction of the first blast furnace begins July 1, 1861. By January 4, 1863, it's operational. The first railroad rails roll off the line on September 26, 1863. A machine shop follows in 1865. A second blast furnace in 1867. The company, now called Bethlehem Iron Company, is producing rails for America's rapidly expanding railroad network. But here's where the story takes its first critical turn. Pittsburgh firms like Carnegie Steel and Lackawanna Steel start eating into Bethlehem's rail market share during the 1880s. Competition is fierce. Bethlehem Iron needs a new customer. They find one, the United States Navy. After the Civil War, the Navy had been neglected, basically forgotten. By 1881, the fleet is embarrassingly outdated. Congress decides to rebuild steam-driven, steel-hulled warships. In 1886, a naval appropriations bill authorizes new battleships, cruisers, and torpedo boats. Bethlehem Iron secures both the forging and armor contracts on June 28, 1887. This single decision reshapes the company's destiny. Between 1888 and 1892, legendary engineer John Fritz builds America's first heavy forging plant right there in Bethlehem. By 1890, they're delivering gun forgings to the Navy. And here's a detail that tells you how dominant they became. For the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, Bethlehem Iron forges a 45.5-foot steel axle for the world's first Ferris wheel, a 264-foot structure. It was the largest single steel forging ever constructed at the time. Iron is profitable. But steel? Steel is the future. In 1899, the Bethlehem Steel Company is officially established, absorbing the old ironworks. The transformation from iron to steel isn't sudden, it's deliberate. Open hearth furnaces replace earlier methods, allowing greater control over composition and quality. Production lines reorganize around steel output. Capital flows towards steel-focused infrastructure. By the turn of the century, Bethlehem isn't an iron company anymore. It's a steel company. And it's about to meet the man who'll turn it into an empire. Charles M. Schwab, and no, not the stockbroker, was born in 1862 in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. German immigrant parents. Limited means. No engineering degree. He started as a clerk at Carnegie Steel, doing paperwork and correspondence. But Schwab had a gift. He could translate the chaos of steel production into clean numbers for the people with money. Andrew Carnegie noticed. Schwab rose fast, not because he knew steel better than the guys on the floor, but because he understood how power moved through an organization. By his early 30s, he was in the room for strategic discussions. By 1901, when Carnegie Steel merged into the newly formed U.S. Steel Corporation, the largest corporation on the planet, Schwab became its first president. But U.S. Steel was bloated, cautious, controlled by bankers. Schwab clashed with J.P. Morgan's circle over strategy. He resigned in 1903. And then he did something brilliant. He bought Bethlehem Steel. The ownership history gets tangled here. Schwab transfers it to U.S. Steel, buys it back, sells it to United States Shipbuilding Company, which promptly implodes. Through the wreckage, Schwab emerges with control again. In 1904, Bethlehem Steel Corporation is officially formed with Schwab as president and chairman. Joseph Wharton, yes, that Wharton, founder of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, co-founds the corporation alongside him. From 1906 onward, Bethlehem Steel trades on the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol BS. In January 1908, Schwab makes the move that changes American construction forever. Bethlehem Steel begins producing America's first commercially successful wide-flange structural shapes, the I-beams that make skyscrapers possible. The design comes from Henry Gray, who patented the process back in 1897. Schwab had tried to convince U.S. Steel to produce these beams. They refused, so he did it himself. The first major project using those gray beams? Gimbel's department store in New York City. 12,000 tons of structural steel. This is the birth of the skyscraper age. And Bethlehem Steel is its midwife. Under Schwab, the company diversifies aggressively. Samuel Broadbent leads the push into iron mines in Cuba and shipyards across the country. In 1913, they acquire Four River Shipbuilding Company in Quincy, Massachusetts. By 1917, the shipbuilding arm is incorporated as Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation. In 1922, they purchase Lackawanna Steel Company along with its railroad and coal holdings. Schwab built Bethlehem Steel in his own image. Authority concentrated at the top, decision-making removed from the factory floor, success measured by expansion and dominance, not adaptability. That philosophy worked spectacularly. For a while. Bethlehem Steel was the most important to America's national defense of any company in the past century. We wouldn't have won World War I and World War II without it. That's not hyperbole. Look at the numbers. During World War I, Bethlehem Steel became a strategic military asset practically overnight. Artillery shells, armor plate, heavy naval components. The plants churned out everything the military demanded. But World War II? That's when Bethlehem Steel became something almost mythological. The company ranked 7th among all U.S. corporations in the total value of wartime production contracts. Their 15 shipyards built 121 warships, more than any other builder in America, representing nearly 1/5 of the entire U.S. Navy's two-ocean fleet. Shipbuilding alone employed 180,000 people. Total employment hit 300,000. Think about that. 300,000 Americans working for a single company to defeat the Axis powers. Eugene Grace, president from 1916 to 1945, then chairman until his retirement in 1957, orchestrated the entire wartime effort. In 1943, he made a promise directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1 ship per day. He delivered, and then exceeded it by 15 ships. 70% of airplane cylinder forgings, 25% of all warship armor plate, 1/3 of all heavy cannon forgings for the U.S. military, all Bethlehem Steel. On September 27, 1941, Liberty Fleet Day, FDR himself stood at the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore to launch the first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry. That same day, the SS James McKay launched from Sparrows Point, and an emergency vessel launched from Fore River in Quincy, Massachusetts. But war demands sacrifice beyond the battlefield. With men deployed overseas, Bethlehem Steel hired women to work the factory floor and guard the gates. They kept the furnaces burning. They met the quotas. And when the men came home, the women were promptly fired. Every single one. That's the part nobody puts on the memorial plaques. The war also drained Bethlehem Steel in ways that wouldn't show up for decades. Equipment was pushed past peacetime limits. Workers were exhausted. Furnaces ran without interruption. Shifts overlapping. The concept of a workday effectively dissolved. Accidents increased as fatigue became unavoidable. And here's the hidden bomb buried in the company's foundation. Wartime profits masked a growing pension crisis. Eugene Grace failed to adequately fund the company's pension plans during the 1950s. At peak employment, contributions that should have been made simply weren't. This would come back to haunt them catastrophically. After the war, Bethlehem Steel entered what should have been an unassailable golden age. Germany's steel mills were rubble. Japan's industry was devastated. For roughly 2 decades, American steel operated with virtually no foreign competition. And Bethlehem rode that wave to its absolute peak. The company manufactured 23 million tons of steel annually. In 1958, company president Arthur B. Homer was the highest-paid business executive in the entire United States. Let that sink in. The guy running a steel company in eastern Pennsylvania was making more money than anyone else in corporate America. Between 1962 and 1964, Bethlehem built the first phase of what became its largest plant, Burns Harbor in Burns Harbor, Indiana. This facility featured the world's first 160-inch plate mill. The company's steel went into some of the most iconic structures ever erected on American soil. The Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, Madison Square Garden, the Waldorf Astoria, 28 Liberty Street, Merchandise Mart in Chicago, the George Washington Bridge, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Peace Bridge between Buffalo and Fort Erie, Ontario. Bethlehem Steel wasn't just a company. It was the skeletal system of 20th century America. Engineers didn't specify Bethlehem Steel because of marketing. They specified it because decades of performance had built absolute trust. Bridges stood. Rails endured. Buildings remained upright. That reputation was earned in tons, not slogans. But empires built on unchallenged dominance develop blind spots. And Bethlehem Steel's blind spots were growing larger every year. The company also profited enormously from its Latin American operations. Iron and manganese were sourced from Venezuela, Cuba, and Brazil at rates that bordered on extraction. In 1960 alone, U.S. Steel and Bethlehem Steel pulled a combined 30% profit on Venezuelan iron investments, and that profit equaled all the taxes paid to the Venezuelan government over the prior decade. During Brazilian President Eurico Dutra's administration, from 1946 to 1951, Bethlehem Steel received 40 million tons of manganese for just 4% of the export income. These arrangements kept raw material costs artificially low, which made Bethlehem's balance sheets look better than the underlying business actually was. When those arrangements eventually changed, the true cost structure would be exposed. Here's where the comfortable story ends. By the late 1950s, Bethlehem Steel still looked invincible from the outside. But beneath the surface, structural rot was setting in, and nobody at the top wanted to acknowledge it. The first problem was technological arrogance. While Bethlehem clung to traditional blast furnace operations, steelmakers in Japan and Europe were rebuilding from scratch with modern techniques, basic oxygen furnaces, and continuous casting technology. These methods slashed production time, cut energy consumption, and reduced waste dramatically. Bethlehem Steel experimented with continuous casting, but they never fully adopted it. Management saw existing infrastructure as proven and reliable. Modernization meant massive capital investment and temporary shutdowns. Both were viewed as unacceptable risks, so older equipment stayed in service well past its prime. The productivity gap widened every year. Foreign producers made steel faster with fewer workers. Bethlehem's output per worker declined against global benchmarks, even as wages kept climbing. What had been a strength, enormous integrated mills, turned into a millstone around the company's neck. Then there were the pensions. Remember Eugene Grace's failure to properly fund retirement obligations during the boom years? Now the bill was coming due. As the workforce aged, the ratio of retirees to active workers kept climbing. Each active worker's output had to cover an ever larger pension burden. At peak employment, those contributions simply weren't made. The money wasn't there when it was needed most. The company lost its bid to supply steel for the original World Trade Center in 1967. A single one of those contracts was for 50,000 tons. All of it went to competitors in Seattle, St. Louis, New York, and Illinois. That should have been a wake-up call. In the 1970s, the hits kept coming. Imported foreign steel was cheaper than anything Bethlehem could produce, even before you factored in shipping costs. Mini mills using electric arc furnaces emerged as a domestic threat. These operations ran on scrap metal, needed fewer workers, required less capital, and could be built closer to customers. Companies like Nucor started small, targeting lower-grade products. But their technology improved fast. Hurricane Agnes caused flooding in 1972 that forced the closure of the Cornwall iron mine in 1973. Grace Mine, a Bethlehem-owned underground operation in Berks County, Pennsylvania, shut down in 1977. The raw material supply chain was fracturing right alongside the market. (1982), the year the illusion finally shattered. Bethlehem Steel reported a loss of $1.5 billion. Not a dip, not a rough quarter. A catastrophic, industry-shaking, existential loss. The company responded with immediate, sweeping shutdowns. Most steelmaking operations were suspended. Thousands of workers were laid off virtually overnight. The company that had armed America through 2 world wars couldn't pay its own bills. They briefly returned to profitability in 1988, but it was a dead cat bounce. Restructuring and closures continued through the entire decade of the 90s. In the mid-1980s, demand for heavy structural products began shrinking. Lighter construction styles, low-rise buildings, didn't need the massive steel grades Bethlehem specialized in. And then came Nucor Yamato, formed in 1987, building a plant in Blytheville, Arkansas, that could produce structural steel at a fraction of Bethlehem's cost. The dominoes fell one by one. In 1991, Bethlehem discontinued coal mining operations it had run under the name Beth Energy. In 1992, the Johnstown plants, originally founded in 1852 as part of the Cambria Iron Company and purchased by Bethlehem in 1923, were forced to close. In 1993, they exited the railroad car business entirely. And then the final blow to the heart of the company. By the end of 1995, Bethlehem Steel ceased manufacturing steel at its main Bethlehem plant. 140 years of continuous steel production in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Done. The furnaces went cold, the gates closed. A city lost its identity. 2 years later, in 1997, the corporation abandoned shipbuilding entirely in a desperate attempt to preserve whatever remained of its steel operations. It wasn't enough. Meanwhile, the pension crisis metastasized. In 1998, a lawsuit was filed in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals after pension benefits were denied. The case, Hollyfield versus the pension plan of Bethlehem Steel, was settled in 2001 in favor of the workers. That settlement triggered a class action suit from Bethlehem Steel's union that resulted in the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation assuming all of the company's pension obligations. It was the largest pension liability assumption in United States history. On October 15, 2001, Bethlehem Steel filed for bankruptcy protection. They became the 25th American steelmaker to file for bankruptcy in just 4 years. Between 1998 and 2001, 25 steel companies. Gone or dying. An entire American industry hemorrhaging out on the courtroom floor. In 2003, the dissolution was finalized. Bethlehem Steel's remaining assets, 6 plants, were sold to International Steel Group. 2 years later, International Steel Group was acquired by Mittal Steel. In 2006, Mittal merged with Arcelor to form ArcelorMittal. That's who owns the remnants today, a Luxembourg-based multinational. The impact on Bethlehem, Pennsylvania was devastating and deeply personal. This wasn't some corporate headquarters in a Manhattan high-rise. The plant had been there since the 1850s. The city grew around those furnaces. Entire neighborhoods were built along ethnic lines. Slovaks, Hungarians, Poles, Italians, Ukrainians, all recruited to work the floor. When the paychecks vanished, local businesses collapsed. Property values cratered. Municipal tax revenue dried up. Services that depended on industrial prosperity faced funding shortfalls that cascaded through the community. Families relocated in search of work. Population declined. A city that had been defined by production and strength became defined by absence. The massive plant, visible from nearly every corner of Bethlehem, stood as a daily reminder of what was gone. The company tried to ease the blow. They hired consultants, developed plans to revitalize the 163-acre site on the south side of Bethlehem, renaming it Bethlehem Works. The vision included cultural venues, recreation, education, entertainment, and retail. The National Museum of Industrial History, in association with the Smithsonian, was planned alongside a casino and retail complex on 600 acres of former industrial land. In 2007, the property was sold to Sands Bethworks, which built a $600 million casino where the steel plant once stood. Construction required 16,000 tons of structural steel, and in a twist of bitter irony, a global steel shortage at the time made it nearly impossible to find. Today, the site is called Steel Stacks, an arts and entertainment district. The 5 rusted blast furnaces were left standing deliberately, serving as a backdrop for concert venues and a performing arts center. The Wind Creek Bethlehem Casino Resort sits alongside. There are outdoor music venues with lawn seating for 500 people. It's connected to the casino via the Hoover Mason Trestle Linear Park. It's beautiful, honestly, but it's a memorial, not a factory. On May 19, 2019, Martin Tower, Bethlehem Steel's former corporate headquarters in West Bethlehem, was demolished. The company's corporate records now sit in the Hagley Museum in Wilmington, Delaware, and the National Museum of Industrial History in Bethlehem. So what killed Bethlehem Steel? It wasn't one thing. It was everything, all at once, after decades of denial. But if you strip away the sentiment and look at the bones of this failure, there are 4 lessons here that apply to any business in any era. Lesson 1. Technology waits for nobody. Bethlehem Steel knew about continuous casting. They experimented with it, and they chose not to fully adopt it. Japanese and European competitors rebuilt their entire industries around modern methods, while Bethlehem patched aging equipment and called it strategy. When the cost gap became obvious, it was too late. Modernization went from being an option to being impossibly expensive. If your competitors are rebuilding from the ground up, you cannot afford to stand still, no matter how big you are. Lesson 2. Fund your obligations or they'll fund your destruction. Eugene Grace's failure to adequately invest in pension plans during the profitable 1950s was a slow-motion bomb. Every unfunded dollar became a liability that compounded over decades. When the ratio of retirees to workers shifted, the math became brutal. The company's pension crisis eventually became the largest liability assumption by the PBGC in American history. Deferred obligations don't disappear, they grow. Lesson 3. Size is not a strategy. Bethlehem Steel believed that being enormous, massive integrated mills, hundreds of thousands of workers, plants spanning multiple states, made them invulnerable. It didn't. It made them slow. It made them expensive. It made every decision require 10 approvals. Mini mills like Nucor proved that lean operations, scrap metal inputs, and proximity to customers could outcompete giants with a fraction of the workforce and capital. Scale without agility is just a bigger target. Lesson 4. A company town dies with a company. When Bethlehem Steel closed its Bethlehem plant in 1995, it didn't just end jobs, it ended a way of life. Neighborhoods collapsed, tax revenue vanished, an entire city's identity dissolved. The lesson for communities is brutal but clear. Economic dependence on a single employer, no matter how permanent it seems, is a catastrophic vulnerability. The steel that Bethlehem poured still holds up bridges across America. The George Washington Bridge still carries traffic. The Empire State Building still stands. The Golden Gate still spans the bay. The company is gone, but its work remains embedded in the American landscape, silent, load-bearing, and permanent. The furnaces in Bethlehem stand cold and rusted now. They'll never light again. But they refuse to fall down. And maybe that's the most honest monument this company could ever get.